Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Fridays at the Symphony. And it's a pleasure, as always, to share with you my unending love for the symphonies of Antonin Dvorak. Simply put, the Bohemian answer to Johannes Brahms as the great Czech composer of symphonies of the middle and later 19th century. We here in America have this love of, well, I think everyone does this. We tend to look at the great classical composers in pairs. We think of Bach and Handel, Haydn and Mozart, Schubert and Beethoven, Schumann and Mendelssohn, and then Brahms and Dvorak. And we always, though we almost never say it, we always see Dvorak as the junior partner in that pairing. We somehow think that Brahms, being the great North German master of the symphony, is somehow just a trifle more profound than Dvorak, the hard-working peasant from that little village in Bohemia. But we don't dare say it. Well, it's about time we had an honest conversation because about this subject, I know that you've been wanting to for some time, so that's now going to happen. It's kind of like Haydn and Mozart. I always tell people when I reflect on my work as a curator of chamber music, Haydn could never have written an opera like Mozart. But Mozart could never write a string quartet like Haydn. Not really quite ever could he really match the genius of Haydn as a composer of string quartets. And the same is true with when you compare Brahms and Dvorak. We also think in seeing but not quite saying Dvorak as this lesser, ever so slightly the lesser of two equals in his historical pairing with a man who was his friend and colleague, Johannes Brahms. We somehow have this idea that Dvorak was influenced by Brahms in the writing of his symphonies. In particular, when we get to Dvorak's Symphony No. 7, the D minor symphony, there's always been this idea that he was somehow kind of aping Brahms in his minor mode symphonies. But actually, by the time Dvorak had completed the work we're going to discuss now, his Symphony No. 5, it was actually it was not just the first published symphony in Dvorak's lifetime. His first four symphonies, while he was alive, never saw the light of day when it came to the printing press. But by the time Dvorak had written his fifth symphony, Brahms had yet to even complete his first, because we're now talking about the years 1874-75. And this is in 1874, this is the time when it's Brahms who is already a very well-known, admired, and powerful composer in the Viennese musical world. You'll remember from our discussion of Dvorak's earlier symphonies, Brahms is one of these all-important lucky breaks in the life of an artist. Brahms is sitting on that imperial Austrian committee in Vienna that it has to decide as to what young composers they're going to give an official state stipend to in order to relieve them of the anxiety of day-to-day existence and have some freedom in terms of time, just some emotional freedom with which to just compose art music, compose just serious music. Brahms is on the panel that awards Dvorak that stipend of 450 gulden. This is the great, along with his marriage at the same time to his lovely wife Anna, who is the sister of the young woman he had been in love with years before. Much like Mozart, he marries the sister of the woman he's originally in love with. This state stipend from Vienna was the absolute turning point in Dvorak's career. And he now had some emotional and temporal freedom with which to compose serious music. And it is absolutely this newfound sense of joy, this kind of easygoing mood is something you immediately hear in the music from 1875. Principally, amongst the many works he wrote from that year, because Dvorak was nothing if not ever prolific. But two major works from that year of 1875 have come down to us in the repertoire as so totally reflective of this newfound, easygoing, joyous mood of Dvorak's personality. Those two works would be the Serenade for Strings, which we worked so hard on and put together for our lacrosse audience. It was just a beautiful experience playing that work up in Viroqua, one of our chamber orchestra concerts. And then the work that we're talking about now, the Symphony Number 5. It's often nicknamed the Pastoral Symphony of Dvorak because it is like Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. It is in the key signature of F major. Now again, as I've been saying over these weeks, composers, especially in the 19th century, are always signaling to their audiences, often via the key signatures of their symphonies, and this is no exception. Just as Dvorak wrote his very outwardly heroic and expansive Third Symphony in the key of E flat, the heroic key, the key of Beethoven's Third Eroica Symphony, so here does he write this gentle, easygoing, very outdoorsy work in the key, very consciously in the key of Beethoven's Pastoral. And like Beethoven's Pastoral, Dvorak's Symphony Number 5 has this overwhelming mood of just a composer, an artist finding joy, and kind of an everyday joy in the delights of the world around him. The other thing one has to remember about Dvorak's Symphony Number 5, or actually we can't forget it, is that for many, many years, up until very recently, Dvorak's Symphony Number 5 was the New World Symphony, his symphony from the New World, which was finally in the 1950s renumbered because, of course, Dvorak's Fifth Symphony was the first symphony in his lifetime to be published. So his publisher, Zimrock in Berlin, gave it the number of Symphony Number 3, though this had no relation to reality, and he did it over Dvorak's objection, but he published it as Symphony Number 3. So if you are of a certain age, or you grew up, say, playing in a youth orchestra that had a kind of an old set of orchestral parts, the Symphony Number 5 was the New World Symphony. And I do remember as a teenaged viola player in my Connecticut all-state orchestra, we were playing, it was listed in the program as Symphony Number 5, the New World. But of course, the New World Symphony is his Symphony Number 9, and that is the literal truth. It is the 9th and final of Dvorak's 9 symphonies. Dvorak's Fifth Symphony, as I was saying, has this overwhelming pastoral mood, this easygoing, outdoorsy feel. Dvorak is not trying to imitate Beethoven in his Pastoral Symphony. This is a very bohemian kind of, very Czech kind of pastoral symphony. You hear it, you sense it from the very beginning in the opening theme, which is given to the clarinet. And here, Dvorak does two amazing things simultaneously. He instantly, with this theme that's really a broken F major chord, this dee dee da dee 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 da da. It's like if you were at a piano and you just broke, arpeggiated an F major chord, you'd have this idea. But the rhythm of it, the dotted rhythm, makes it a very catchy tune. But in doing so, he sets this pastoral mood, this aura that never leaves the entire, certainly the entire first movement of the symphony. But at the same time, he uses that catchy little broken chord of a tune to generate all of the thematic material that will follow in this sonata allegro form of a first movement. So by now, you still have, in this work, Dvorak really brings it all together. He kind of codifies the language that he has been developing in his first 4 symphonies, this very natural, long-breathed kind of lyricism that also has its roots in Czech folk music traditions. But by this point, he has finally disciplined himself in regard to the formal organization of his ideas. So the music, the mood of the music is so pastoral and just naturally expansive, and yet the organization is tight as a drum. The second movement in this kind of Czech national style is not, this is not, again, Dvorak in any way, shape, or form imitating Brahms. If anything, Brahms was influenced by Dvorak in the writing of his symphonies. But Dvorak, in this slow movement, there are no Brahmsian metaphysics here, my friends. This is a ballad. This could have been a work of chamber music, of salon music. It could have been like a solo cello with piano accompaniment. And actually, it's one of the great examples of how gorgeously Dvorak writes for the cello section, for the cello in general throughout his career. Of course, he probably gave us the greatest cello concerto that exists, that great late work that's deservedly famous. But this slow movement is really a ballad in a big kind of three-part form that, again, is like a concerto for cello section. You'll see why. Cellists love to play it, and you can't blame them. There is kind of what's called a Quasi Ataka connection. There's only the very slightest pause. You even wouldn't really, if you'd never heard the piece before, you wouldn't know quite what Dvorak was doing. He just very elegantly and subtly connects the end of the slow movement into the beginning of the third movement, which, as is the tradition, by now Dvorak is back to writing traditional four-movement symphonic structures. This is the scherzo of the symphony. And again, here Dvorak reveals his just, patriotic intensity as a Czech composer. No one but a composer from the lands that we call, broadly speaking, Czechoslovakia could have written this vigorous folk dance, which sounds like it was taken right from one of Dvorak's very famous, beloved Slavonic dances, which were written for piano duet and also for orchestra. And by the 1870s, 1880s, those Slavonic dances are played all over the world and making Dvorak and that publisher in Berlin, Herr Zimmerach, lots and lots of money. So the scherzo is like lifted right from the world of the kind of the popular Dvorak, the Dvorak that, again, the Dvorak of the Slavonic dances, which by this time there's a copy of the Slavonic dances like in every piano bench in Europe. The finale is strange, and this is, I say strange kind of reservedly, because by this point, as I was saying, Dvorak has codified his language. He is the great kind of man of the people from a village in Bohemia, from some far-flung village in the Habsburg Empire, who has moved to Prague and is becoming widely known as a master of his craft. And he is developing a language that is kind of streamlined and almost international. It's almost an international product. It's kind of ready for export. So Dvorak, being a genius, says at the opening of the finale, he's telling his audience, yes, I'm writing a very predictable four-movement romantic symphony, but that doesn't mean I can't surprise you. And the surprise is that the first, 50 or 60 bars of the last movement are in a completely foreign key from F major, the home key. The entire opening section of the finale is in the key of A minor, which really has pretty much almost nothing to do with the home key of F major. And the entire finale is a kind of a dialogue of these two key centers. It's the one movement of the four movements of the symphony that has a bit of that discursiveness that all too often marred the first two symphonies of Dvorak. You'll remember when I was talking about the very first two symphonies of Dvorak, there's this, remember that phrase, there was this cornucopia of beautiful ideas, but he didn't quite know how to put them all together in a kind of a tightly wound package. This last movement is the one movement of the Symphony No. 5 that has that kind of discursiveness of his musical youth. But here Dvorak is doing it for a very, very defined reason. Again, to kind of tease you as the listener into a mood where you just don't know where he's going to go next. It's like the finale of a symphony that is kind of really more like a symphonic poem. But he finally does wrap it all together and ties it with a bow in a gorgeous and glorious F major coda, where he actually even brings back that, remember the broken chord idea of the very beginning of the first movement, is very cleverly, very subtly brought back for the final peroration at the very end of the symphony. As I was saying, with the first four symphonies of Dvorak, very much like, say, Brahms or Sir Edward Elgar in the next generation, was basically a self-taught genius. And Dvorak very proudly learned by doing. And it's in the first four symphonies of Dvorak that this great composer develops and refines his art as a composer of symphonies. But as I was saying, with the Symphony No. 5, Dvorak as a symphonist is ready for export. He is ready to take on the great musical centers of not only the Habsburg Empire, like Vienna, but of the entire German-speaking world. And it's not for nothing that by this point, actually a few months later, his newfound friend and colleague, Johannes Brahms, will persuade his publisher in Berlin, Zimrock, to start publishing Dvorak's symphonies as well. I've talked about signals, the way composers make signals in their major works. Key signatures is one of those major signals. The dedication of the symphony, not unlike the dedication of a novel, was anyway in this time, in the 19th century, profoundly important as well as again, another manner of signaling your intentions. Dvorak very consciously dedicates his Symphony No. 5 to Hans von Bülow, B-U-L-O-W, Hans von Bülow, one of the very greatest conductors in Germany at that time, and to this day remembered as one of the great conductors of all time. A colleague and confidant of Johannes Brahms, the frenemy of Richard Wagner, because Wagner eventually ran off with his wife, Cosima, who was the daughter of Franz Liszt. Okay? Really complicated. But we won't go there. That's a whole other story. But Hans von Bülow was just the reigning German conductor of his time, along with Hans Richter in Vienna. Bülow was mainly busy in Berlin and in Weimar. But in making the dedication to von Bülow, Dvorak, again, is saying that he's ready to play his role as a composer on the international scene. And lucky for us, Hans von Bülow accepted the dedication and did so happily. And in writing to the composer with a note of gratitude, he said to Dvorak, "You are, along with Brahms, the most blessed composer of our time." And I could not agree with him more. Dvorak's ever fresh, ever pastoral Symphony No. 5.